Hello everyone and welcome back to another video. This is Eisenherz and today we're going to have a look at some of the most frequently asked rules questions and most common mistakes in cEDH. So without further ado, let's get started. Well, this seems like the most basic rule you have to understand to make a game of EDH work properly, but I still see people getting it wrong all the time. So let's go through it. If the active player, A, casts a spell, priority goes back to them. If they don't choose to hold priority to perform more actions, priority will pass to the next player in turn order, B, then to the next player, C, and then to the last one, D. If priority goes back to the active player without any other players taking any actions, the spell on the stack will resolve. This is the easy part, but in cEDH that's rare. Triggers occur all the time and spells are being cast all the time. So let's assume this scenario. Player A is the active player and casts an ad nauseam. They pass priority to player B. Player B responds with a counterspell. They pass priority to player C. Player C responds with a revertebrate targeting the ad nauseam. They then pass to player D. Player D casts a blue elemental blast targeting the revertebrate in response and passes priority. How does the stack resolve and how does priority get around? For the blue elemental blast to resolve, player A, B and C will have to pass priority, without taking any actions. Let's assume they do. Blue elemental blast will resolve and will counter the revertebrate. So who will get priority now? Player D? No, player A, because they are the active player. Whenever a spell or ability resolves on the stack, priority goes back to the active player. So after blue elemental blast resolves and counters revertebrate, priority will go back to player A. They can choose to respond to what's on the stack, so ad nauseam and counterspell, or pass priority. If they pass priority, priority goes back around the table in turn order. If nobody performs any actions, the counterspell will resolve, countering the ad nauseam, and priority will be back at the active player, because A, a spell just resolved, and B, the stack is now empty. So in short, whenever a spell or ability resolves on the stack, priority will be reset to the active player. Triggers are a very hot topic, especially mistriggers, because depending on what REL you play at, these situations will be handled differently. So keep in mind that at the end of the day, you can choose how to handle it in your playgroup or pod. So there are different kinds of triggered abilities, but for now we will focus on the most commonly seen in cEDH, like Crom, Rhystic Study and the Tabernacle at Pendrell Vale. If Crom triggers, you have to draw a card. And this can be relevant, for example, when you have an empty library. So what happens if you miss the trigger? First of all, it's important to know that the player controlling the card that triggers is also responsible for remembering the trigger. But in order to maintain board state, all players are responsible to point out triggers. While triggers can be missed accidentally, it is illegal for the Crom player to intentionally miss their trigger. This of course only applies if someone missed their trigger multiple times in a game and gets talked to by a judge. So what happens with the Crom trigger now? Well, it's easy. If the trigger is less than one turn cycle old, any opponent may choose to put the trigger on the stack right then and there. The player who missed the trigger has no choice on whether or not to rewind the game, delay the trigger, or even dismiss the trigger. Keep in mind that this is also true for mistriggers like Rhystic Study. Even though it says you may draw a card, missing the trigger does not mean that you factually declined the trigger. Any opponents may choose to have the trigger put on the stack within that one turn cycle. You might obviously decline, but you don't have to. Tabernacle at the Pendrell Vale is a bit more complicated, because although player A might control the Tabernacle, the trigger occurs on the active player's side. The wording of Tabernacle says all creatures have, so the creatures actually trigger, not the Tabernacle. This means that the active player is responsible for remembering the trigger. So what if they missed it and went from untapped directly to draw? And again, the answer is fairly simple. Any opponent may choose to have the trigger put on the stack right then and there. Keep in mind though, that there are no rewinds. If you missed a Tabernacle trigger, tap out to cast spells, and then an opponent points out you missed triggers and demands them to be put on the stack, your creatures will die. And this is also true for pact triggers. If you missed the pact trigger, tap out to cast spells, and then an opponent points out that you missed your pact trigger, you might not be able to pay for it and you will die to the pact. This is a situation that happens quite often, but still people get it wrong. Who gets to search when there are two opposition agents in play? Let's assume player A casts a demonic tutor. In response, player 2 flashes in an opposition agent. Opposition agent resolves, and Prio goes back to player 1 with demonic tutor on the stack. Prio passes to player 2, then to player 3, who takes no actions, and finally to player 4, who flashes in his own opposition agent. This opposition agent also resolves, and finally player A's demonic tutor resolves. Now the question is, who gets to control player A when they tutor? Well, the answer is also pretty simple. The last opposition agent to hit the field has the newest timestamp, and therefore applies. That's all you need to know to do it correctly. Player 4 gets to control player 1 while they tutor. If, however, player 4 decides to cast a tutor themselves, player 2 will be able to control them, because player 4's opposition agent does not apply to themselves. And as a bonus fact, if you control an Avid Mind Sensor and the relevant opposition agent, you still only get to look at the top 4 cards of your opponent's library, because technically they are tutoring and you are just controlling them. So in short, the newest opposition agent is the relevant one. These two cards are common examples for replacement effects. You can tell if something is a replacement effect from the word instead. Like Laboratory Maniac lets you win the game if you would draw from an empty library instead of dying. Well, Dauthi Voidwalker tells us to exile cards with a void counter on them, basically putting them in the Dauthi zone, instead of putting them into the graveyard. Rest in Peace tells us to just exile cards instead of putting them into the graveyard. Now if both cards are in play and a player would be putting something into the graveyard, both replacement effects apply at the same time. The owner or controller of the card being affected can now choose which replacement effect to apply first, and then, if it's still applicable, the second replacement effect would apply. In our example, the player chooses to put their spell into exile through Rest in Peace in order to not feed the Dauthi Voidwalker. As the card is now already in exile, Dauthi's replacement effect is no longer applicable and therefore can be ignored. So in short, you get to choose which replacement effect affects you and your cards. As easy as that. The stack can get very large in cEDH, with multiple triggers and spells happening every turn. Also, permanents and cards get stolen a lot, with the best examples being Gilded Rake, Wishclaw Talisman, Praetor's Grasp, Opposition Agent and Dauthi Voidwalker. But what happens to the stack, stolen cards and permanents when a player dies? The answer isn't that complicated if you go through it step by step. First, all objects the dying player owns are removed from the game. To clarify, objects are all kinds of things, like permanents, cards in all zones, and spells and abilities on the stack. All of these will be removed from the game. Next, all control changing effects stop. So any cards they might have stolen from you will be back under your control or the player that last had control of them, like a Wishclaw Talisman or a Gilded Rake. Third, all stolen permanents and spells that weren't previously controlled by other players, like creatures stolen with bribery, go into their owner's exile zone. And finally, priority passes through the turn, but without an active player. The stack resolves as usual, the turn progresses through all steps and phases as usual, priority passes as usual, and the turn does not just suddenly end, like a lot of people would assume. And that's it. 5 common mistakes explained. I hope this video helps to understand some common situations in cEDH better. If you enjoyed this video, please let me know. I might do a follow-up video in the future. Please remember to like, share, comment and subscribe. Hop over to my Discord server if you want to play some games with us. And if you want to support my channel even more, please consider becoming a patron. This is Eisenherz and auf Wiedersehen.